Imagine the cold, not the chill of a winter morning or the bite of a drafty room. Imagine a cold so absolute it feels like a physical weight pressing against your chest. It is 30 degrees below zero. Outside, the wind is not merely blowing, it is screaming, a rhythmic, deafening howl that turns the Ural Mountains into a landscape of alien hostility. You are inside a canvas tent, huddled in the darkness. You are exhausted and undressed, having stripped off your wet outer layers to sleep. And then, something happens. Something so terrifying, so immediate, and so incomprehensible that it overrides the most primal instincts of human survival. You don't have time to find the laces of your boots or to grab your jacket and hat. You don't even have time to untie the tent flaps. Instead, you grab a knife and slash the canvas from the inside, tearing open a jagged mouth in the only shelter keeping you alive. And you run. You run barefoot into the snow, into the pitch black and the screaming wind, heading toward the tree line a mile away, leaving behind your warmth, your supplies, and your life. This is the nightmare scenario that investigators pieced together in February of 1959 in the northern Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union. It is a story that has been told 1,000 times, usually reduced to bullet points and wild speculation about aliens or yetis. But the true horror of the Dyatlov Pass incident lies in the silence between the facts. It lies in the quiet, methodical destruction of 9 experienced hikers by a force that, to this day, defies a complete explanation. The group, led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, were not weekend tourists. They were grade 2 hikers from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, highly skilled, physically elite, and training for a grade 3 certification, the highest difficulty rating available in the Soviet Union at the time. They knew how to survive, knew how to layer their clothes, how to pitch a tent in a gale, and how to read the snow. Igor Dyatlov was known for his caution and his rigor. The route they planned was difficult, traversing the Otorten mountain, but it was well within their capabilities. The group set out on January 23, 1959. 10 students started the journey. One, Yuri Yudin, was forced to turn back due to a flare-up of chronic joint pain. He hugged his friends goodbye, envious of the adventure they were about to have. He could not have known that his pain had just saved his life. He was the only one who would grow old. For the remaining 9, 7 men and 2 women, the journey continued. We have their diaries and photographs. These records paint a picture of high spirits, camaraderie, and the mundane labor of winter trekking. They wrote about the warmth of the stove, the difficulty of the deep snow, and the beauty of the landscape. There was no sense of doom, no foreboding in their final entries. On February 1st, late in the afternoon, the group deviated slightly from their intended course due to worsening weather. They found themselves on the exposed slope of Kholat Syakhl. Rather than losing altitude to find shelter in the forest below, a move that would have cost them time and energy, Dyatlov made the decision to set up camp right there on the slope. It was a bold decision, perhaps a training exercise to practice sleeping on an incline, but it was not a suicidal one. The hikers leveled the snow, pitched the tent, and settled in for dinner. They took off their boots and hung up their wet clothes. The atmosphere was calm. And then the timeline stops. What happens next is not a story told by survivors, but a forensic puzzle pieced together by the search party that found the tent weeks later on February 26th. When the rescue team, led by fellow students and military personnel, reached the site, the scene they discovered felt less like a hiking accident and more like a crime scene frozen in a chaotic snapshot. The tent was half collapsed, burdened by weeks of snow accumulation, but it was the condition of the canvas that stopped the searchers cold. Slashing cuts destroyed the side facing downhill. Subsequent analysis proved these cuts were made from the inside. This was not a creature trying to get in. It was 9 experienced, calm, and rational hikers desperate to get out. Inside the tent, the scene was confusingly orderly. Boots were lined up, backpacks were stacked. Heavy jackets and trousers were left behind. Food was laid out, suggesting they were preparing a meal or settling in for the night. There was no sign of a struggle inside the fabric walls. No blood, no chaos. Only the slashed exit and a trail of footprints leading down the slope. The footprints were perhaps the most haunting detail of the initial discovery. There were 8 or 9 sets of tracks, distinct in the frozen crust. Some showed feet covered only in socks. Others showed a single felt boot. Some were entirely barefoot. The tracks were walking pace. They were not sprinting. They were not scattering in panic. They moved in a group, holding together, walking steadily toward their doom in the tree line below. The searchers followed the tracks down the slope for about 500 meters before the snow cover buried the trail. At the edge of the forest, under the branches of a large Siberian cedar, the first horror awaited. Beside the remains of a small, desperate fire, the searchers found Yuri Krivonishenko and Yuri Doroshenko. They were stripped to their underwear. Their bodies were frozen solid, lying side by side. But the details, upon closer inspection, were jarring. Their hands were burned. The skin on their knuckles and palms was charred, not just from the proximity to the fire, but suggesting they had tried to handle the burning wood with their bare hands, perhaps trying to feed a dying flame as hypothermia robbed them of their coordination. Above them, the cedar tree told its own story. Branches had been snapped off up to a height of 5 meters. The bark was torn, and traces of skin and muscle tissue were found embedded in the wood. One of them had climbed the tree frantically, obsessively. Was he gathering wood? The branches at that height were thick and difficult to break. Or was he climbing to see something? Was he looking back up the slope toward the tent they had fled? Or was he trying to climb away from something on the ground? Reports from the initial search party note a detail often lost in the broader retelling. The bodies under the cedar had been moved after death, or rather, they had been disturbed. Their clothes had been cut off. This wasn't an act of malice, but of desperate survival by the remaining members of the group. Between the cedar and the tent, 3 more bodies were found in the days that followed: Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Rustam Slobodin. They were spaced out at intervals on the slope, their heads pointed back toward the tent. They had not died at the cedar. They had died trying to crawl back. Zinaida was found with bruises on her torso. Rustam had a minor fracture in his skull, though not fatal. Dyatlov was clutching a birch branch, his posture suggesting he was bracing against the wind. They had realized the fire at the cedar was not enough. They knew their only chance was to reclaim the tent. They died fighting the mountain, inch by inch, until the cold stopped their hearts. At this point, the narrative seemed tragic, but explicable. A sudden event, a panic, hypothermia, a sad case of nature overcoming man. But the search was not over. 4 hikers were still missing. It took 2 months to find the rest. May came to the Urals. The snow began to thaw, revealing the secrets hidden in a deep ravine about 75 meters away from the cedar tree. Deep under 4 meters of snow, in a den they had seemingly tried to construct to escape the wind, lay the final 4. Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolevatov, and Nikolai Chebobrignols. If the bodies on the slope were a tragedy, the bodies in the ravine were a nightmare. This is where the story shifts from a survival disaster into something far darker. The external condition of these bodies was horrific, partly due to months of decomposition and water damage from the melting snow. But the internal autopsy reports revealed violence that defied the setting. Nikolai had a major skull fracture, the bone driven into the brain. Lyudmila and Semyon had massive chest fractures. The medical examiner, Dr. Boris Vozroshteny, compared the force required to cause such injuries to that of a car crash or a shockwave. Here's the anomaly. There was no external trauma corresponding to these internal breaks. No bruises, no cuts, no abrasions that would suggest a fall from a great height or a beating with a weapon. It was as if they had been squeezed by a colossal, crushing pressure. And then, the details that have fueled 60 years of nightmares. Lyudmila was missing her tongue. She was also missing her eyes, part of her lips and facial tissue. Semyon was also missing his eyes. While pragmatic forensic pathologists often attribute this to scavenging by small animals or the action of running water in the ravine, the image remains visceral. The idea of Lyudmila possibly still alive while her chest was crushed, unable to scream, creates a horror that transcends the clinical explanation. There was another oddity in the ravine. Semyon Zolotaryov, the oldest member of the group, a war veteran and a man who was largely a stranger to the students, was found wearing a camera around his neck. The film was damaged by water, yielding no images. Why, in the midst of a freezing life-or-death flight, did he grab a camera? And why was he wearing someone else's coat? The clothes on the bodies in the ravine were a patchwork of the dead. They were wearing torn strips of trousers and jackets belonging to the two Yuris who had died under the cedar tree. They had taken the clothes from their frozen friends to wrap their own feet and chests. It paints a picture of a prolonged, terrifying struggle in the dark, hours after leaving the tent. They were alive long enough to scavenge the dead, yet something had broken them with the force of a hydraulic press. As the investigation deepened, the disturbing details began to accumulate, resisting the shape of a simple accident. When the clothes from the ravine were tested, they triggered Geiger counters. Beta radiation was found on the sweaters and trousers of Ludmila and Alexander. The levels were not high enough to cause immediate sickness, but they were significantly above background levels, up to double or triple the norm for the area. Where does radioactive contamination come from in the middle of the uninhabited Urals? The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, noted that the tops of the fir trees near the tent were burned, but not from a fire on the ground. He described it as if a heat source had come from above. Then there were the lights. During the weeks surrounding the incident, another group of hikers camping about 50 kilometers south reported seeing strange orange spheres floating in the night sky in the direction of Kholat-Syakhl. The weather service and the military also logged reports of glowing circular objects. Investigator Ivanov later admitted in an interview, years after the Soviet Union collapsed, that he was pressured by high-ranking officials to close the case and bury the data about the flying spheres. He believed, until his dying day, that some form of energy phenomenon was responsible for the deaths. We must also consider the strange metal fragment. A piece of scrap metal, described as a ridge from a rocket or aircraft, was rumored to have been found in the forest nearby. The origins of this metal were never officially identified in the public files, but it fueled the theory that the hikers had stumbled into a testing zone. And let us not forget the final photograph. The film recovered from the cameras of the main group documents their trip with heartbreaking clarity, smiling faces, setting up camp, silly poses. But the final frame on Krivonishenko's role is different. It is blurry, dark, and abstract. Some see a figure emerging from the trees, others see a light source. Most likely, it is a manipulation error, a shutter snapping while the camera was being loaded or dropped. But in the context of what followed, that blurry gray smear looks like the last glimpse of something incomprehensible. So how do we reconcile the crushed chests, the radiation, the slashed tent, and the barefoot tracks? Theories have been constructed to fill the silence, but each one has a fracture line. The most scientifically accepted theory today, supported by recent Swiss simulations, is the slab avalanche. It posits that a small delayed slab of snow, triggered by the wind and the cut the group made into the slope to pitch their tent, slid down during the night. It didn't bury them, but it smashed into the tent while they slept. This explains the chest injuries of the ravine group. If they were lying on the hard ground and the weight of the snow hit them, the compression could break ribs without breaking skin. It explains the slash in the tent. Panic, the need to escape a crushing weight. It explains the lack of footwear. But the theory struggles with the retreat. If they were injured that badly in the tent, how did they walk a mile to the forest? The footprints were calm. There was no dragging. And if the snow hit the tent, why were the tent poles still standing when the searchers arrived? The slab theory is clean, precise, and logical, yet it feels too small for the magnitude of the dread found at the site. Then there is the infrasound theory. The idea that the wind, interacting with the specific topography of Dead Mountain, created a Kármán vortex street. This phenomenon generates low-frequency sound waves below the range of human hearing, which can induce profound physiological effects: nausea, dread, paranoia, and the feeling of a presence. It could explain the irrational panic, the cutting of the tent, the flight into the dark. It explains the madness, but it does not explain the physical trauma. Sound does not crush skulls. This leads us inevitably to the military parachute mine theory. This theory argues that the group was in the wrong place at the wrong time during a Soviet weapon test. A parachute mine, detonating in the air above the ravine, would create a concussive shockwave capable of inflicting the internal injuries found on the bodies without external contact. It fits the burned treetops. It fits the radiation, if the weapon was dirty or specialized. It fits the reports of orange lights. It explains the hasty closure of the case and the secrecy. Under this lens, the scavenging of the clothes takes on a darker tone. Perhaps they were trying to wash off chemicals or dust. But if this were true, why leave the bodies? Why not clean the site entirely? The Soviet military was efficient at erasure. Leaving 9 bodies and a tent full of diaries seems sloppy for a cover-up of that magnitude. There are darker whispers, of course. The local Mansi legends speak of the mountain as a place to be avoided, though they hunted there. Early suspicion fell on the Mansi, suggesting the hikers had trespassed on sacred ground. But the investigators found no other footprints, no sign of a struggle, no arrows, no blows from rifle butts. The Mansi were cleared quickly. Their way of killing does not involve invisible crushing force. We must pause to look at Semyon Zolotaryov again. He is the ghost in the machine of this narrative. He was 37, much older than the others. He had a mysterious past with the NKVD, the precursor to the KGB. He had tattoos that were not typical for the era or his rank. Strange, nonsensical letters, a military star, and the date 1921. He joined the group at the last minute. When his body was exhumed recently for DNA analysis, the results were confusing, sparking debates about whether the man in the grave was truly Zolotaryov. While likely a clerical error or degradation, it adds to the unease. Was he a handler? Was he there to meet someone in the mountains? Some theorize a controlled delivery, that the radioactive clothes were bait, a handoff to foreign agents gone wrong. It sounds like spy fiction, yet it is the only narrative that attempts to explain the camera around his neck and the specific localized violence. But even that feels like an imposition of order upon chaos. There's a final detail that is rarely discussed, a small thing found in the tent that doesn't fit the grand theories. It was a cloth belt, not belonging to any of the hikers. It was not a standard issue item. It was just there, unclaimed. Maybe it belonged to one of them, a forgotten spare. Or maybe it is the only physical evidence of the thing that was waiting outside. The truth is, the Dyatlov Pass incident remains a Rorschach test for our own fears. If you fear nature, you see an avalanche. If you fear the state, you see a weapon test. If you fear the unknown, you see the Yeti or the spheres. The official Soviet criminal case was closed in May 1959. The conclusion was written in language that is both bureaucratic and deeply poetic in its vagueness. It stated that the cause of death was a compelling natural force, which the hikers were unable to overcome. Force majeure. An act of God. The file was stamped secret and archived. The area was closed to hikers for 3 years. The parents of the deceased were told never to ask questions. When you look at the photos of the tent today, protruding from the snow like a broken rib, you are looking at a frozen moment of transition. Inside that canvas, 9 people were warm, intelligent, and alive. Seconds later, they were scattered into the void. What lingers is not the violence, but the sequence of decisions. The cutting of the canvas, the walk down the slope, the fire that failed, the decision to take the clothes off the dead. We want the answer to be physics. We want it to be a slab of snow, because snow is mindless and indifferent. Snow doesn't watch you from the tree line. Snow doesn't wait for you to undress before it strikes. But when the wind picks up on the slopes of Kholat Syakhl, whistling through the rocks of the Dyatlov Pass, it sounds like a voice. And if you listen closely to the silence between the gusts, you might realize that the most terrifying part of this story isn't how they died.